Hello and welcome to this on-demand session as part of the GTR UK virtual conference. Today we're going to talk about global Britain and the pivot to Asia that we've seen over the last year. In particular, we're going to talk about the Indo-Pacific region, and with me to discuss all of this is Andy Burwell, who is International Director at the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI. What I'm going to do first, though, is just introduce the subject and why we're so interested in the Indo-Pacific region. The pivot to the Indo-Pacific region was made quite clear in the integrated review that came out earlier this year and is a quite significant shift in UK foreign policy. The region has become very important to us because we are now in negotiations to join the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Trade Agreement covering the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And growth outside of Europe is a very important element of overall trade strategy. We've been trying to seek trade alliances and trade deals with Japan, with Australia, with New Zealand, Canada, and so on. And a lot of this is a precursor to us becoming full members of the CPTPP. The Indo-Pacific region, however, is strategically very important to us, not just because it represents an area where we could grow outside of Europe, but because it puts trade at the heart of the way in which we see our security as a nation and we see our growth as a nation. It's a noticeable shift away from Europe. The language around it is very important. It's marking this as one of the big strategic priorities for the UK government. But it's also worth noting that we're not the only nation that is pivoting towards the Indo-Pacific. So the Americans are also prioritising this area. If you look at what they've done, they've put together this thing called the Quad, which is India, Australia and Japan plus the United States, to try and isolate China. The EU members, some EU member states in particular, have separate pivots to the Indo-Pacific, and obviously the EU as a whole is thinking very much strategically about a competitive threat from China and how it manages that threat or perceived threat. In terms of global Britain, then, what we're doing is we're actually joining our allies in pivoting towards Indo-Pacific and marking out this area as something that is strategically important for us. Now, from the perspective of trade, what's important is that there are some very important areas that we can develop specifically. So we do a lot of trade. We exported roughly 124 billion to the Indo-Pacific region in 2020 and imported 217 billion in 2020. That's a very large amount. It's not as important as the EU in volume and value terms, but it's still very significant. But the big things that maybe we want to think about in the discussion, Andy, and I'll turn to you in a second, is how we actually use and pivot to the Indo-Pacific to develop some of the priorities that global Britain has, particularly around China, around sustainability, and of course, around digitization. So let me just start with a couple of questions. How is business seeing this pivot? Is it something that business is taking and embracing with open arms, or is it something that they're thinking, well, you know, maybe we could have had a stronger focus on Europe? Andy, what do you think about that?
Thanks, Rebecca. Look, really good to be here and really good to be kind of supporting the GTR today. Look, so from a business point of view, I think they are seeing this as a real opportunity. I think, as you say, you know, Asia represents the fastest growing markets in the world. You know, 66% of the world's middle class will be in Asia by the end of this decade. You know, there are real economic strengths there that the UK can and should be targeting. Obviously, many UK businesses are still struggling with the impacts of COVID, and are still focused on, you know, actually survival or cash flow resilience. There are many businesses still working out how to trade with the EU post-Brexit, and actually what the mechanisms are. And we've seen that with the trade data with the EU and the impact over the last year. But that aside, I think what business are really looking for is a bit of clarity from the UK government on what their trade strategy looks like, how business can engage with it. Certainly that point about 66% of the middle class being in Asia by the end of this decade is really important, because actually that marries up to kind of UK economic strengths. So it marries up to our world-class services industry. It marries up to our education industry and our universities. It marries up to, actually, if you look at it from the agri perspective and agriculture, the premium products that the UK has and where really our strength lies on the global stage. So there are kind of many aspects that I think business see as an opportunity, but the devil will inevitably be in the detail.
I think it's interesting. I mean, we, as you know, run an exporter monitor of UK businesses. And one of the things that we did see in Q1 this year was a huge spike in the number of exporters across the country and pretty much irrespective of sector. One of the smaller spikes in growth, though, was with agriculture, and we're seeing that as potentially something that is seen as a little bit of a threat from the Indo-Pacific, specifically Australia and New Zealand. How do businesses actually deal with this? Is it something that's actually less important for exporters than it is for importers? And switching to Asia isn't just something you can do overnight, is it? I mean, if you're already in Europe, switching to Asia is something quite difficult. So, as you say, there's still quite a lot of uncertainty around all of that.
Yeah, look, a lot of it's about education as well. I think, particularly for businesses who only ever historically exported to the EU, many of those businesses now are having to learn, I suppose, the art of exporting, which you need to go to the rest of the world. So, filling in customs declaration forms, looking at tariffs. There's so many different aspects of trade with the EU and just trade globally, which businesses are now having to learn. From an agri perspective in particular, I think there are huge opportunities for agriculture on the global stage. I think the industry does need to look at productivity, and I think that's just a UK challenge, kind of as an economy. And we need to ensure that we are globally competitive, but we shouldn't run away from that. And I think this is again a pan economic thing, that we need to understand the benefits of exporting for our nation. That it makes companies more resilient. We've seen that during COVID. The companies that actually survived the best were the companies that were exporting. It does make you more productive. It does make you more innovative. So welcoming actually that sort of competition and using that to drive our future economic growth, I think is really important.
Is there anything specific about the Indo-Pacific region? I mean, if I'm thinking about exporting, let's say, Scottish whisky to the region, is there something that is specific about the Indo-Pacific region that companies need to know? Is that something that the CBI can advise on, or is it something that your businesses tell you is difficult or easy?
All of the above. CBI recently published its kind of strategy for the next 5 years called Seize the Moment. And that very much identifies kind of key growth markets, particularly for services, but equally for agriculture as well. And I think there is a key piece for not just for CBI, but for all of the kind of trade associations, the government, to work together with local councils, with mayors, with regions, to talk to business and encourage them to export and to show them how. The UK government's recently launched an exports academy. So there's the how you export, there's the why you export, and I think there's also something about educating people about kind of what the future trends are and actually where the potential growth is in the longer term, so they can develop a longer term trade strategy rather than just focusing as well on the here and now.
Do you see any particular sectors that are going to advantage from a pivot to Indo-Pacific in particular? Is it digital? Is it services? Is it manufacturing? I mean, we can see in our data, for example, at Coriolis, we can see some quite big increases in electronics trade, for example. Cars have always been a big sector of exports. So there are some sectors that are obviously going to benefit because we already have those supply chains in place. Other areas, for example, service sector might be more of a challenge, but we also have strong links because of the global supply chains that we have. So what's your sense on where the priorities are going to be, do you think?
So Personally, I think services needs to be a huge priority. A, the UK economy is a services economy. B, globally, the services market and services trade is increasing dramatically, as you'll know, Rebecca. And C, if you look at where actually kind of trade policy discussions are going, which will essentially open up markets around the world and reduce costs, ease businesses trade. They are in areas such as digital services, climate and sustainability, all these sort of areas. I know you've done a lot of work in digital space, and actually, it's a huge opportunity for business to understand where these developments are going, and then grapple with the opportunities that kind of come out of them.
Yeah, I mean the digital. Let's dwell on the digital side for a minute, because the work we did for the International Chamber of Commerce was quite interesting, because it said, just amongst the SME sector, if we can have more digital documentation, and if that becomes part of legal reform, then actually it's going to create 25 billion pounds worth of new economic growth, and trade growth. So it's going to create a huge amount of efficiency gains, and a lot of this is around improved access to SME trade finance, because it streamlines the whole process, and it creates something that's much easier for banks to manage, because the whole process has become digital. To what extent do you think the CBI and obviously the government as well are prioritising those sorts of areas, because there is a massive opportunity there?
No, I completely agree. Look, the work you did with the ICC was excellent. Actually, it fed directly through to what we did as the B7, so the business side of the G7, and then actually to the statement from the G7 leaders themselves. So it really did have impact. And I think that shows where that sort of digital policy is going. In March, the G7 leaders committed their nations to agree on policy areas such as data localization, such as digital contracts and e-payments, etc. So there's lots of areas where that digital approach, which does reduce costs, it speeds up trade. It particularly supports SMEs as well, who are obviously caught by many of these issues. That policy is being developed on a global stage, led actually by countries such as the UK, such as Singapore, such as Australia, such as New Zealand, all these nations who are a part of CPTPP. And you can see the trend.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that, it was a real pleasure to do that research and get involved with it, because it was lovely to be doing something that you really felt was going to have an impact. But one of the pieces of feedback that came from elsewhere around the world, and maybe this is something that Global Britain can dwell on a little bit, was the fact that that people from other countries were saying, well, because the UK is doing this, so much law is actually written or so much trade is actually defined by UK law, that if the law changes, it's going to create an impact across the whole of the Commonwealth, for example, and it will create an impact across countries that aren't part of the Commonwealth but simply have their documentation defined under UK law. So the scope of all of this is absolutely massive. But maybe we could dwell a little bit on the SME dimension, because I know you run SME surveys, you run surveys of international businesses. The problem for SMEs at the moment, I think, is access to finance. And we've seen UKEF come out with, a vastly improved structure. The guarantees have been incredibly successful as a mechanism for bringing SMEs into the exporting fold, if you like. What can we do that's more than this right now? Because there's so much that could potentially be done. What is it that your members are seeing and saying about access to finance in this international space?
So again, I think a part of it's about awareness. I still think many companies do not understand the excellent offer that UK Export Finance has. If you look at international competitors, there are many excellent services out there that actually their national businesses are tapping into. I don't think enough UK businesses know or are aware of UKEF services. So that's the first one. The second is, I think, diversifying the banks and digital banks which have access to that UKEF funding and can support SMEs to contribute to it. It's quite expensive for banks to kind of set up and process the payments. So I think just broadening that out, particularly into that digital bank space, is going to be quite important.
I think we talked a little bit about COVID, and India is obviously it's been a villain and a hero in all of this, partly because of the variants that have come out of India, and the third wave that has come out of India, but India and the Indian market potentially for UK businesses is absolutely massive, and there's some really interesting things that can be done. I mean, one of the fastest growing areas of trade between the UK and India is in pharmaceuticals, for example. If you're just looking at not the largest area, but you're looking at the rates at which exports are growing, pharmaceuticals is very important. Is there something sort of generically positive that we can pull out of any trade deal that we do with India and anything that might come out of our relationships there? Because it's always been strategically a very important partner for us.
Yeah, look, India is, as you say, a strategically important partner, full stop. There's a long relationship there, but our trade and our levels of trade do not necessarily follow through with that, and actually with the size of the market. If you look at, compared to China, for instance, I think it's about, our trade's about a third of what we do with China at the moment, and I think our exports are about a fifth. They're much smaller than they should be, and India is notoriously a very difficult market to export to. Obviously, your Scotch example earlier, I think tariffs are at 150% at the moment. It's hugely expensive, hugely diversified across the different provinces. It is a difficult market. So actually, there's quite a lot of low-hanging fruit for DIT and for the government to focus on in the enhanced trade partnership. Obviously, there is a consultation process out at the moment, which we all at CBI do a lot of work on with our members and with business as a whole. But there are huge amounts of kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of market access barriers, such as mutual recognition of professional qualifications, which we can kind of build on before we actually try and do that kind of overarching huge free trade agreement, which, as the EU found with India, takes time. But Japan has seen the benefit of it. So there's both sides.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, part of the problem is actually the bureaucracy associated with all of this. And again, to go back to the digital point, that's something that might actually be solved through digital solutions. I mean, again, this pressure to get bills of lading, to get documentation around trade automated and digitized will help SMEs enormously. Because I heard a story a few years back about a company that had tried exporting fresh food to India and they hadn't had the right paperwork. And this is anecdotal and it's a few years ago, so it's not current now, but they'd actually had fresh food sitting on a beach in a container, and actually it had obviously gone off and they hadn't been able to import it after all because of the bureaucratic processes. And digitization, again, an emphasis on digitization and support from the government and support from all the internationalization agencies, UKEF and the CBI, is going to help that process, isn't it?
Yeah, and COVID obviously has been terrible, is terrible, but there have been so many benefits from a trade perspective which have been driven by the need to actually go digital. Be it e-signatures, the reduction in wet stamps. There are many aspects which I think we now need to build from. Obviously, India kind of walked away from the RCEP agreement, so the other Asian agreement, as well as CPTPP, largely because of digital and data localization concerns and data protection. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, I still think, with the Indian government in this kind of digital data space, and something we're working with Indian industry on in terms of how we show a single industry view of the importance of the free flow of data and the free flow of data with trust.
Let's dwell on that data sharing element, because I mean, it's a challenge for businesses to share their data. There are rules and regulations around data sharing, cross-border data sharing. The whole digital agenda is around enabling data sharing while keeping that confidentiality. We can't talk about the Indo-Pacific region without talking about China. And the big challenge, I think, for the US, for Europe, and for the UK is to manage that relationship with China, because I mean, one of the things that we found from all the work that we do is it's not necessarily the data that's the problem, it's who owns that data and what is being done with all of that data. How do your members and how does the CBI view our engagement with China in the future? It is a huge opportunity for us, but there are huge risks associated, and they are tied up with the whole geopolitical framework at the moment.
Yeah, completely agree. And what we say at CBI, and I think as business as a whole, is that we need a pragmatic approach to China. You cannot ignore the opportunity. Even through the US China kind of trade war, if you want to call it that, US businesses still did a lot of business and a lot of trade with China. The licenses that their financial services firms received during the height of that US China trade war, it just shows actually that effectively trade will win out, and trade can operate outside of kind of political dimensions. And that pragmatic approach between engaging with the opportunity, embracing it, and enabling your businesses to trade cross-border, whilst being able to have an honest, pragmatic relationship with a nation and tackle challenges is I think really key, and obviously important in particular, with China. I think there are other aspects to it, and maybe we can come on to climate change in a bit and sustainability, but we can't tackle that without China. There are big global issues that need big global solutions, and China is a really, really important part of that.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And maybe we can conclude on that sustainability element, because I mean, the UK itself is not a huge trading partner of China's. China's important to us, but China itself, we're the 17th largest trading partner of China. So we don't actually strategically have that much influence over China's behaviours at all. And our trade has been quite lumpy with China. I mean, that's fair to say as well. But our power, if you like, to be able to influence China is because we're taking a leadership role in digital, but also in sustainability. And as you say, we cannot do anything. And I think the Biden administration has recognized this as well. On sustainability, the world needs China, and it needs a multilateral approach to sustainability. So where are the priorities likely to be around that? Are there going to be measures, do you think, to promote the businesses that have a sustainable agenda who are trading with China? And let's just talk about green. Because I mean, everybody knows I have a real passion, a real campaign against greenwash at the moment. It's also about human rights abuses, right? I mean, it's about what Biden was talking about at the G7 summit and what he talked about in his supply chain document, which is actually about making those supply chains clean and sustainable in every sense of the word.
Yeah, I think taxonomies is a really interesting one from across this sort of agenda, and whether you're talking about green or ESG as an environment, sustainability, governance, there's so many different ways of kind of cutting it. I think from a business point of view, that multilateral space is really important. Because inevitably, much like we're seeing with the joint statement initiatives in the World Trade Organization, you need like-minded nations to come together to agree it's kind of the principles of how to trade in a sustainable way, and what the kind of mechanisms around it to be able to support that trade in an effective way. I think for the UK, as you say, are leading in many of these spaces. I think the UK Export Finance annual report this morning basically said that from a credit finance perspective, as an agency, they're second in the world in supporting sustainable businesses and sustainable finance, I think to a tune of about £2.3 billion last year, which I think is really credit to them, to be honest with you, but also to our industry who are looking to expand and invest in these sort of projects and these sort of products. From a China perspective, you're right. It's broader than just pure. Let's just work with them on green. There is that broader kind of ESG perspective. I think again, it's the multilateral space is really key here. One nation cannot go it alone. The US cannot go it alone. I think the World Trade Organization, I think the UN need to be underpinned and supported. They need modernization, and I think that's what we've been calling for a lot. And they need to include China in those discussions. but not let that also slow down progress. Because if we're going to make any progress at COP26, then we need to make these changes now. And I think the unabated coal announcement at the G7 was a really good example, where a nation like Japan, who fundamentally were behind the times in making these sort of commitments, could step up and say, no, we are going to embrace the change that needs to happen, and industry can support that.
I think that's a very positive note to end on. I think if I had to summarize what we've been talking about, really, the conclusion that we've come to is that the Indo-Pacific is actually an ideal opportunity for us to show just how multilateral our perspective on trade is, and that we can lead the way through digital, we can lead the way through sustainability, but working with our partners, we're all much more capable of having that agenda together, which is in essence what Global Britain was all about. It's not about Britain alone, it's about Britain in partnership with everybody else around the world. And I think that is a very positive message to be sending out through this pivot to Asia. Andy, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation as always, and hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.